Hi, I'm Dr. Marcello Sbrocca, and in this video I'm going to talk about how to and when you should not use a metronome. Now, this video is not an anti-metronome video. It's just a video where, well, I'm talking about a couple different things. I'm kind of talking about what I think is most important in music, or rather what's most fundamental, and kind of what role rhythm plays in that, and along those same lines, what or how a metronome can help you with that and how it can get in the way. So the first thing I'm going to, and also this is a bit of an expansion on a previous video I made. The video I'm talking about is the video on how to practice and prepare music. In there, I have a section where I'm talking about, well, how you prepare music. You know, what are the steps I go through when I get a new piece of music, and where a metronome fits in that and whatnot. And I'll touch upon that briefly, but I'm just kind of going into a little bit more detail in this video, and also talking a little bit about some of the issues that can come up with metronomes and or over-focusing on rhythms or the precision of rhythms. So the first thing is, you know, what is music and what is the role that rhythm plays in it? So I'm going to just cut right to the chase. What is music? Well, you know, when I was younger, people would say music is organized sound, but all sorts of things are organized sound, but we would not call them music. What somebody calls music is subjective a lot of the time, and it depends on the person's culture and things like that. You know, to one group of people something sounds like music, and to another it doesn't. But to me, the best definition I've ever heard of what is music is the sound of human motion. Now, that is not saying, you know, the rustling of the fabric, you know, when you move is music. It's like, let's say you see a gymnast or a ballerina or something. They make a beautiful movement or whatever. That's what I mean. You know, when we have a piece of music like this. This is from the Paul Creston saxophone sonata. You know, it's not da 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 dum da dum. It's da dum da dum. You know, there's an arrival point. It builds things up, and it's an arrival. It's like some movement or some group of movements that have something to do with each other. But there's, you know, it's like music is, you know, it's made up of shapes, you know, but they're just aural, you know, and it's abstract. You know, so that's why people say it's a sound of human motion. And to me, that is the best definition I've ever heard of it. All of that to say that, to me, there is nothing more fundamental in music than musical gestures. To me, music, a piece of music, is made up of a bunch of musical gestures. And those musical gestures form phrases, or sub-phrases, and then the sub-phrases form phrases, and then they form larger pieces, and before you know it, you have a whole piece. You know, a whole piece of music, or at least a movement, is a collection of phrases that kind of have something to do with each other. You know, so it kind of tells a story, whether it's programmatic or abstract. And so what is the role that rhythm plays in that? Well, rhythm is just one of the aspects that create these gestures. You know, it's rhythm, dynamic, articulation, all those things come together to form gestures. You as the musician have to figure out, you know, what the gestures are. You know, you're not just going up and you know, there's something you're doing with the music. It's not just playing right notes and rhythms. Which leads me to an issue that people have with metronomes. They treat them too much. It helps reinforce this idea for some unfortunate musicians. And I say unfortunate because it's much less fun to play music this way. But they just look at music like it's a bunch of right notes and rhythms. and when they're musical, to them that's just like some kind of vague little thing you sprinkle on at the end, like, oh, I played it like this, or I played it like that. Whereas to other musicians, what is musical is figuring out all of these gestures, all the nuance to all of these gestures, and what they have to do with each other, and how to bring them out. And it's way more objective, and it's way more detailed, and it's something that requires a lot more preparation, and it's so much more fun to look at music this way. So that's why, that's why a metronome can be a little bit of an issue. When we play with a metronome, a lot of times people tend to develop a couple bad habits. The first one is they will start to play like a metronome. They will start to weight, put a little bit of weight where the metronome beats. Even if musically, gesturally, there shouldn't be weight there, There's rhythm. Rhythm is, again, it's just one of the elements that help us understand the gestures going on in the piece, but, it's like, just because rhythms fill up an entire measure, wholly and squarely, doesn't mean that they're supposed to be like that. Just because something on the page seems so clear doesn't mean that musically that's exactly what's going on. And sometimes metronomes can bring that out in people. They just make them play up and down, rigid all the time, and they just want to focus on the objective aspects of music. Whereas there's this artistic, subjective element to music that, makes music so much more fun and beautiful, and that's why we want to hear somebody over somebody else. That's why sometimes you'll want to hear somebody who even plays some mistakes over somebody else who plays perfectly. It's because of how they play, It's very important. Let's see, the next thing. Another thing that can happen with a metronome is you become dependent on it. You kind of need that metronome, and so then when you play with other people, it's like, oh my gosh, you're so lost because you're so used to having this consistent beat going on all the time. Okay, so then what is the point of using a metronome? Well, to me, a metronome does a couple things. It can help you if you are, playing a rhythm wrong, or it can help you when you are playing unevenly. Maybe you are somebody who was, you're using the metronome to help you not speed up through a section. Or maybe you're slowing down or something like that. Or you have a rhythm wrong in your mind. You think you're playing something rhythmically accurate, but then maybe you go to a rehearsal or you play for somebody and you realize, oh my gosh, I'm playing this wrong. So a metronome can help with that. But okay, so that to me is the point of a metronome. It's just to help you it's like a ruler, really. It's not something you shouldn't play like the metronome. The metronome is there just to kind of check things occasionally. And sometimes you have to check things a lot, and sometimes, you don't use a metronome hardly at all. Now I'm going to talk about how I use a metronome. In this video I say how not to use a metronome, but that's really just to show people that, in my opinion, you shouldn't be using a metronome all the time. It can, as I just said, create bad habits. It can make you, like a lot of people, over-focus on the objective elements of music, when in reality, of course, music is much more flexible than we think. So anyway, the first thing I do with a piece of music is I, practice it without my instrument. I look at the music and I make sure I understand everything. Now, just focusing on rhythms and not focusing on musical details, I make sure that I understand all of the rhythms. If a rhythm doesn't make sense to me, then I'll go through and I'll try and make sense of it. I'll figure out where the pulses are. If it's like some unusual rhythm like, 5/4, then I want to, realize, oh, the second beat should be after the third note, and things like that. And so you have to kind of figure that out. The next step is still not with a metronome, but you're going to clap the pulse and sing the music. Now I say clap it instead of playing with a metronome because you can speed up and slow down your clapping whenever you need to. And when you're looking at a piece of music for the first time, that's important because if you're playing with that rigid metronome, it's going to make you tense and it's going to make you have to do everything, or at least more than you want to or that you're able to do at once. I'm clapping because I'm just trying to line up what I'm singing with a pulse. Even if the pulse isn't terribly consistent, it's just about knowing where that beat is. Then, once you become comfortable with that, and you know where all the pulses are, you understand for the most part how the rhythms fit on top of that pulse, then you can introduce the metronome. Okay, and then you can sing it with the metronome. Along those same lines, if you're really good at this, you can conduct, you can conduct it in the correct meter, and you can sing it in solfege. Now, for some people, that's really advanced, so don't worry about that. But that can be very effective because then the notes just, they're not just da 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 or la 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 la, and you're not just, the pulse isn't just anything. You know where one is, you know exactly what the notes are, so that by the time you start playing it with your instrument, you are many steps ahead. But anyway, so that's the next step. Then you can start playing it with your instrument. And I do the same thing. I play it while either having an internal pulse or moving my foot or something like that, or kind of bobbing to the music, which is a bad habit that you have to be careful of. But then once I feel like, even if I have to kind of rubato my way through the piece, speed up and slow down, just because maybe it's technically a little too difficult or rhythm it still hasn't seated quite right, you're just trying to make sure that the piece lines up with some kind of a pulse, even if it's inconsistent. It's just knowing about where are those pulses and where does the piece line up with those pulses. Then you can take it to playing it with a metronome, right? Now, some people might think that that's pretty obvious, but to progress in that order for the most part. But this is, if there's one thing to learn from this video, other than musical gestures are the most fundamental aspect of music, in my opinion, not rhythm. All of those details, that's one thing I wanted to mention. Forgive me for kind of going out of order. Everything is to help your performance of a piece be more effective, to help you more effectively bring out those musical gestures. Which is to say that if anything is going to be compromised a little bit, it's going to be all of those secondary elements, before the musical gestures get compromised. Which is to say you might bend a rhythm a little bit if it makes sense musically. You're not going to let something become drier and drier musically to make it more and more rhythmically perfect. Some situations demand that there's a lot of rhythmic accuracy, especially when you're playing with other people, so sometimes that happens, but you really need to fight to always make things musical because that's the point of all of this stuff. Anyway, now to get to what is an exercise or a way to look at using a metronome that I think is the best way to use a metronome, the best way to figure out rhythms in a piece of music, the best way to help you improve your rhythmic accuracy. And to some people this is counter what they've always been told. For example, most people will tell you to put a metronome on 1 and 3 or 2 and 4 so that you are accountable for the other beats if the piece is in 4/4. I think that is a terrible way of using a metronome. I think that's a terrible way of improving your rhythm. That can be a test later on, but in terms of helping you improve your rhythm, to help you play more evenly, to help you get rid of inaccuracies in your understanding of rhythms, you need to do this way. This I guess you could call it, it's not really an exercise, it's just a way of using a metronome. And that is, instead of taking the metronome and going less fine, making it coarser, I make it finer. So if I'm playing a piece of music that is broken up into, like the pulse of the piece is quarter notes, I will take my metronome and put it on eighth notes. Now, especially if you're not familiar with the piece, initially this is going to be very difficult, because you have twice as many pulses that you have to listen to, that you have to be aware of, that you have to then take the piece and lay on top of. All right, so you're taking everything and you're making it even more precise. And that's what helps you get better at rhythm. It's not about making the beats bigger. Then what you do is you just play the rhythms more inaccurately. It doesn't help you. I'm not a jazz saxophonist, but I remember there's a master class of the famous jazz saxophonist Michael Brecker talking about playing with a metronome on 1 and 3 or 2 and 4, and he said he hated doing that because it made him depressed because he always rushed. Now, he was somebody with impeccable time and rhythm, and he kind of meant, it was probably kind of a joke, but to me, I take that it's not so much I take that seriously, it's that to me I do the same thing, and it never helped me. Some people have such a strong sense of time and rhythm that using a metronome is easy, and when they have to play with other people it's very easy, though I typically find that those kind of people have issues with musicality and seeing the phrases. But then a lot of people who are really good with phrasing and musicality and all those gestures I was mentioning might have a really hard time keeping things consistent, which sometimes is okay, but sometimes it's really bad, especially when you're playing with other people, because then you're always getting lost and whatnot. So it's a balance. But I digress. You put the metronome on a finer beat, and if you find that you're overwhelmed by how many beats you're hearing, you just simply slow it down. You slow it down as much as you need to, that you can do it accurately, and this is the key here, without tension. You cannot be tense when playing with a metronome. It will just make you play worse. Okay, so that's really important. And then the next thing is, once you're able to get comfortable playing with the metronome, even just a little bit, you have to make sure that you are not putting emphasis where the metronome is, pulsing. That's extremely, extremely important. Now I'm going to do a quick little demonstration with an excerpt out of a piece of music. I'll put the piece of music on screen and I'll have a metronome going, and I'll kind of do this together with you guys. I'll make it short so it's quick, but that way I can kind of demonstrate what I'm talking about. Alright, here we go with the demonstration. I'm just going to go over a small part of the first movement of the Paul Creston Saxophone Sonata. You should be seeing on your screen the first page, and what I'm talking about in particular that we're going to work on is the third measure of the second stanza, and we're going to go all the way till the high F sharp in the third stanza. So let's go through things how I mentioned. So first is, I see that, I'm looking at it, I'm making sure I understand all the rhythms. I'm making sure I understand how long all the rests are. I see it's primarily 16th notes. We have a couple notes that are tied, like the high E sharp at the end of the second stanza going into the beginning of the third stanza, and as well as, we have some shorter rests and so on. I feel like I understand that about it. I also see that the piece is by the quarter note. So to me, unless I'm finding the piece to be terribly easy, and I know this is not the hardest piece for a lot of people, but it doesn't matter because this way I'm showing of working on pieces applies to any kind of piece of music. But anyway, since it's by the quarter note, we're going to think about it as by the eighth note. So, if you're somebody who's playing this piece and you find that you keep cutting the tied notes short, or you are playing for example, that high A sharp at the end of the third beat of the third measure of the second stanza, if you find you're playing that too short, and same with the very end of the first measure of the third stanza, this exercise can help with that. So I'm going to sing it, and I'm going to clap by the eighth note. Da 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 dum, da dee da 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 dee, da dee da dee dun dee dun dee. Right? Now, I'm not a great singer, and I'm not singing with solfege because I want this to be as simple as possible, but you see I'm clapping, and singing with it. If the rhythms were really complicated, it would be no problem to me to kind of slow the clapping down. I'll do that. Da 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 dum, da dee da 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 dum, da dee. So if you're having difficulty placing where that pulse is because you don't understand the rhythm, this can help you get started with that. The first step is knowing where are the pulses. Now, I know this is, again, easy, not a hard excerpt, but when you get into more complicated pieces, it's just about, approaching a rhythm and knowing where the pulses are and remembering that. But since these are very common rhythms, you don't really have to fight so much with that, unless you're at a much more beginner level, which is fine. The next thing I'll do is I'll sing it with a metronome. I'm going to put a metronome, let me try 1/16, and see if this is a comfortable enough tempo for me. Yeah, to me this is a perfectly fine tempo to work on this. If you need to make it slower, that's okay. Da 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 dum, da dee da 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 dum, da dee da dee da dun dun dum. Try not to be tense. I'm trying to relax as I do it. And again, this is more about understanding what's going on, not so much playing yet. All right, now we're going to play it. I'm just going to play it. You're not going to see this because you're just going to see the music, but I'm going to move or tap my foot to the beat as I play it, and it's going to be not very musical. Alright, I felt pretty good about that. Now I'm going to put it with the metronome. Okay, maybe some of you could kind of tell that in the beginning I actually, ever so slightly, did rush a little bit with some of those notes, so I kind of noticed that as I played it with the metronome. But I felt comfortable doing that, and then you can move it to the next step of playing it. If you want to, you can then put the metronome, you can slow it down, and I will, and then you can put it on the quarter note if you want. And especially for pieces where you had to really work at it and you had to really slow it down, and it was a lot mentally for you to keep that fine eighth note division while playing, you'll find that by the time you switch it back to a quarter note, it's very easy and you feel very free. Even when you play it with somebody and they're playing something more complex, it's so nice to then play with a human being who's not, some super rigid metronome. But anyway, I'll play with a quarter note now. And also, it's very important to practice this back at that finer division, and try and make sure you can do it musically, because as I said earlier, you don't want to play like a metronome. Okay, not my best playing, but this is definitely kind of an awkward setup, but hopefully that gives you an idea of how this works. You know, if you are going to work through a whole page with that eighth note subdivision, I think you'll find that it is mentally exhausting to do that. But it is so helpful and it is so freeing once you can do it. The last step of this kind of my way of working with a metronome is, I should have mentioned this earlier, but what I like to do, of course, is you want to be able to play the piece without a metronome, and you want to be able to play it well without a metronome. So you have to practice just running the piece through. And it's especially important to run the piece through all the way like you mean it. And that gives you an idea of how you play. You know, we use a metronome and we use a tuner or a drone and all these things to help us play more accurately. But it's very important that you spend time playing pieces all the way through. You know, and last thing before I conclude the video, playing with metronomes and tuners are great and all, but we always need to spend time, you know, just listening to how we play. Maybe that's listening as we play or recording ourselves and listening to it. But I like to make the comparison between, you know, music and like an artisan who's making something with their hands. You know, they might use a compass and a ruler and all these different measuring devices to make sure things are symmetrical and whatever. But then they always take a second and they take the object and they hold it out in front of themselves and they go, does this look right to me? And that's the same thing I do with music. It's, does this sound right to me? You know, and if it doesn't sound right, what is it? And so on. Anyway, now on to the conclusion of the video. Alright, hopefully you enjoyed that demonstration and found it helpful. As somebody who struggled with time to rhythm a lot when I was younger, that exercise, I figured that out myself. I'm sure other people have done it, but I figured that out myself, and that has saved me so many times. So I hope that can help some of you, and I hope clearing up this idea of what music is, what the role is that rhythms play in music, and how a metronome can and can hinder your ability to do all those things has been helpful. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them down below, and thank you so much for watching.